Hello everyone, and welcome to the second part of the mini-series Russia is not great. So, while it is not true that Putin hacked the US elections or that the Kremlin is at fault for Brexit or whatever conspiracy baloney is fashionable today amongst the extreme left, that does not mean that Putin is the good guy, nor does it mean that Russia is a great place. It could be, and it certainly was before the Bolsheviks took over, but it is not implicitly true that it is now, just because the dying left-wing establishment in the West is absolutely mental. The left going nuts, spewing complete lunacy about Russia does not justify false and/or misleading stances about Russia like sadly too many commentators do. So, in the following minutes, we will take a look at the facts rather than what the RT or Sputnik says in English about Russia. So, without further ado, let us begin. Chapter 2: Living in Russia. Or better said, surviving in Russia, because even the best periods of Russia under Putin are still significantly beneath even the poorest EU members such as Bulgaria or Croatia, and most of the times in most indicators way beneath African countries. Lithuania, Equatorial Guinea and Kazakhstan. What do all of these have in common? They all have a higher GDP per capita than Russia. India, Indonesia and Sri Lanka. What do these have in common? Well, fewer people, proportionally speaking, live below the poverty line in these countries than in Russia. And this is just the beginning. In virtually all indicators that give the casual observer some indication as to how people live in a country, in almost all of them, Russia ranks very low. In terms of life expectancy, Russia ranks 153rd in the world, better than Guyana, Tajikistan, Ghana or Kenya, but worse than Kazakhstan, Iran, Ukraine, Guatemala, Belarus, Brazil or Latvia. But this number is misleading. This number is the result of an averaging between St. Petersburg and Moscow on one hand and the rest of Russia on the other hand. In the two big metropolitan areas, the standard of living is still decent, but only 16 million people live in total in these two cities. Kazan is also a place with a quite decent standard of living, but even with Kazan included, that still means 18 million people, at best. That's 12 or 13% of the total population. The rest of the 87 to 88% of the population of Russia lives in the rest of the country, where things are significantly worse. In most of Russia, there is usually no work, and when I say no work, I don't necessarily mean one cannot find a job, but that there is no one to work, because your average Russian doesn't particularly like working. For many years, this issue was mitigated due to the open borders policy that Russia has with many Islamic nations. And yes, Russia has an open borders policy, so much for the mythology that Russia practices strong borders and rejects globalism. Anyway, for many years, Muslims from Uzbekistan, Tajikistan and even as far as Pakistan supplanted the necessary workforce. They weren't particularly great workers, but at least they would show up. That changed as well as of 2014, as many of them either left the country to find work somewhere else or did what Muslim immigrants in Europe do, start having children and go on welfare. You didn't think this problem only exists in Western Europe, did you? So, let's read from the pro-Kremlin paper Gazeta.ru from an article published in January 2015 titled "In Russia, There is Nobody to Work." Here's some excerpts. Quote, "Russia is now in a demographic catastrophe analogous to none in known history," says the head of the Institute for Social Analysis and Forecasting of the Russian Academy, Tatiana Malieva. According to her, part of the problem is that the official figures do not reflect the real picture. The unemployment rate in Russia is so low that we can be proud of. Somewhere 6 months ago we had a 5 and something percent unemployment, and now we go to 4.9%, and maybe at the end of the year it will be even less than that, said Russian President Vladimir Putin in November 2014 G20 meeting. It is good, if not a very good performance, compared to many of our partners, he added. The Ministry of Economic Development forecasts for 2015 a 6.5% unemployment figure, yet the Ministry of Labor published a forecast going as high as 8 to 9%, Maleev said at the forum, but everyone should calm down as she believes that this estimate is overhyped and overly dramatic. But the labor market problem is not in the level of unemployment or employment, but in combination of rising unemployment in some areas and with a shortage of staff in other areas. The economic situation is forcing some enterprises to move to 3 or 4 days working weeks, Maleev said. Reductions have already started in the financial sector, the media, and in various trades, including construction. The financial sector and some trades will give us the female unemployment, whilst construction and transport will increase the male unemployment. And we already know that there is also another problem: men themselves, explained the speaker. Now this is not a feminist rant, but rather a very honest look at the economy of Russia that even the Kremlin papers now have to acknowledge. Speaking of Russian men, there aren't that many of them, and those that are tend to be rather old, rather alcoholic, and severely more unhealthy than their counterparts anywhere else in Europe. As I was saying, there's metropolitan Russia, where 12 to 13% of the populace lives, and then there's the rest of Russia, where the overwhelming majority lives. Even when averaged with metropolitan Russia, the life expectancy of a man is 64.7 years, lower than Iraq, Pakistan, North Korea, Egypt, Bangladesh, or Bulgaria, equal to countries like Gabon, Myanmar, Mongolia, and Senegal, and only marginally better than countries like Namibia, Yemen, Congo, or Ethiopia. In other words, Russian men have, on average, a life as long as the war-torn African and Islamic countries. The average life expectancy in Russia, placed at 70.5 years, is significantly increased by female life expectancy, which stands at 76.3, although that one is misleading too, as in most of Russia, women over 70 are almost as rare as men over 70. But anyway, this disaster is only partially shown by numbers, which probably won't convince that many people, especially those vested in believing that Russia is great or at least preferable to Europe. The top 10 countries in Europe with most alcohol consumption looks like this: Belarus, Moldova, Lithuania, Russia, Romania, Ukraine, Andorra, Hungary, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. But you see, not all alcohol is created equal. 53.5% of the alcohol consumed by Czechs is beer, and another 20.5% is wine, and only 26% is spirits. So while an average Czech drinks 13 liters of alcohol a year, only a bit over 3 liters is hard liquor. Same goes for Romania, where 50% of that alcohol in that number is beer, 29% is wine, and only 21% is liquor. So while an average Romanian drinks 14.4 liters of alcohol a year, only 2.9 liters is hard liquor. Not so with Russia, and Belarus, Moldova, and Ukraine for that matter. In Russia, 51% of the alcohol consumed is hard liquor, with beer representing 37.5% and wine only 11.5%. In other words, your average Russian drinks almost 7.6 liters of hard liquor per year, twice the European average. Now, why does this matter? Because alcoholism in beer makes you a bit fat and noisy over the long run. Alcoholism in vodka gives you cancer. It is thus no surprise that Russia leads the world in alcohol-related deaths. More than 30% of deaths in Russia are directly attributed to alcohol, and this is a graph from 2012. Since then, things have gotten worse. But still, compared to the rest of Eastern Europe, except Estonia, which, as all Baltics, is a unicorn in many stats for a reason we don't have time to discuss, but compared to the rest of Eastern Europe, alcohol is a huge issue in Russia. So is suicide, with the exception of Lithuania, again a Baltic unicorn. But discounting the tiny nation of Lithuania, the highest suicide rate in Europe is in Russia, and most of those suicides come, again, from that rest of Russia that doesn't live in the 3 or 4 posh cities which the regime parades ad nauseam in the English language media as being true Russia. No, true Russia is the hundreds of thousands of square kilometers full of small villages and towns that have no hope of ever coming out from poverty. It's their Rust Belt, if you want, only several hundreds of orders of magnitude worse. And this is just the beginning. Russia also has one of the fastest growing HIV epidemics in the world, as documented by the Russian press. There are at least 1.2 million people infected with HIV in Russia, and 1.2 million is a very conservative estimate. It's probably closer to 1.5 million, or 1.2% of the national population. That may not sound like a lot, but the average in Europe is a third of that, and dropping. But anyway, we'll talk about HIV more in the next episode when we tackle societal degeneracy, a phenomenon widely present in Russian society to levels barely imaginable even to their neighbors, let alone most of Europe. So yeah, living in Russia not just sucks, after all it sucks in Bosnia too, but living in Russia is an unmitigated nightmare for the majority of the population, and to make things worse, there is little to no hope of things ever improving. Now mind you, Russia is a big country, and as such it makes sense to have extreme cases in certain areas. It's unavoidable in countries with a big landmass and also a relatively big population with many isolated areas. But in Russia, the extreme cases are the norm rather than the exception. China and India lifted hundreds of millions of people out of extreme poverty, even as they haven't been very big on human rights. That's the crux of the matter. Other dictatorships, like China, at the very least, presided over an improvement of their people's lot. Slower than it should be, but improvement nonetheless. In Putin's Russia, this simply did not happen outside a few tiny metropolitan pockets, and the blaming on Yeltsin game doesn't work anymore. Putin has been having absolute control of things for 17 years. You can blame certain mentalities or even certain systemic dysfunctions on the Soviet era or the Yeltsin era, but the economical conditions of the Russian people today are not the fault of anyone but themselves and their leaders. Yeah, sure, one can correctly point out that meaningful opposition isn't exactly allowed to exist, and that certain election rules and procedures are intentionally made to keep opposition from gaining ground. Sure, all of that is true, but it is also true that Putin's popularity is sky high. Sure, not 146%, but nevertheless high, even when measured by Western polling agencies. Putin is a symptom of the problem and an obstacle towards solving the problem. And the problem is that Russians have lost faith in life after being severely damaged by the Soviet experience. And that damage has been, under Putin's watch, successfully transmitted to the next generation. And the consequences of that are, and will continue to be, terrifying for the future of Russia. Russia cannot continue like this, and lying to itself, to its people, and to its friends abroad to hide the problem isn't helping anyone except Putin and the oligarchs around him. Everyone else loses, and over the long run, Putin loses too. And with that said, thank you for watching, thank you for your support, and talk to you all soon on Freedom Alternative.